Hello, everybody. I want to welcome all of you to the Cinegear 2018 panel discussion on the Panasonic GH5s. First off, I know none of you want to hear me talk, but you got to hear a little bit. I know you came to see these four gentlemen, talk to them. But I'm Matt Frazer, and I work as I'm a conduit between filmmakers, like these gentlemen up here on the stage, like the folks out in the audience. You give me what you want, and then I work to help get those things into our cameras. That's probably the easiest way to describe my job. Recently, we released a camera called the GH5s. It's been out for a few months now. And as a part of that project, for the initial launch, we contracted with Mystery Box to produce some content for our YouTube channel. And then for the NAB show, we worked with Sam KJ and we worked with Nick on a project for the NAB show. And I wanted to bring them up on stage so they could discuss with you their experiences with the camera, give you some tips and tricks on how to shoot with it best. So I want to go ahead and start by introducing our filmmakers. Our first filmmakers are from Mystery Box. This is Jacob Schwarz, and then this is Samuel Bilodeau. Yes. So Jacob is the director, and Samuel is he's the head of production and technology for Mystery Box, and so I want to thank you guys for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks. Hey, no problem. So first off, I want you guys to tell us just a little bit about yourselves. Jacob, why don't we go ahead and start with you and what your role is at Mystery Box?
Yeah, so we founded Mystery Box back in 2010. My wife and I just graduated from Brigham Young University in film, and so we kind of wanted to start our own little production company. And so we went ahead and bought a Red camera, and then we started making films for YouTube in 4K. So that was kind of our start into making content in general right after we graduated. So that kind of introduced us a lot to, Ultra HD, HDR, 60p, 8K, eventually 8K kind of content creation. And so that's kind of where we came from. We're based in Salt Lake City, Utah. And kind of right now we kind of just, we do a lot of work in HDR, and I think that's kind of what attracted Panasonic to having us do some stuff for them with the new GH5s. So yeah.
Anecdotally, I totally lucked into these guys. We were working on an HDR project earlier, and Mystery Box are clearly the best educators on the web on how to master and produce for HDR. So when we were working on a project, we were fumbling around the internet trying to figure it out. We ultimately stumbled on the Mystery Box website, and that's ultimately what gave us our direction for our first HDR project we did. And then I said, well, why stumble in the dark when I can work with the guys who know more about it than anybody on YouTube? So that's why we picked them. Samuel, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so Jake and I actually worked together at BYU. While we were there working in the film department, I was in charge of the post technologies there. My interests and background is in technology. I started in IT and then moved into the creative aspects of filmmaking and post-production. So my passion is figuring out how to use the new technologies, figuring out how to get the best image quality out of it, figuring out how to leverage the new creative possibilities that all the new technology gives. And then I can go and read the engineering documents and translate that for the filmmaking world to help other people then go and do the same thing. And that's something that at Mystery Box we're super passionate about, is not only working it in ourselves, but helping everybody else work in it too.
Yeah, because we always like to be on the fringe of the new technology, and so whenever new stuff comes out, we like to, not only do we want to implement it in our own storytelling, but we also want to help make sure that we build a community of other filmmakers that can actually use it as well. So. Perfect.
Well, why don't we go ahead and I want to show the piece that you guys worked on for us. So what we're going to showcase is a film you made called Horizons. Does that hold up pretty well on this tiny screen behind us? Anybody notice that the color rendition's just a little bit different and the black level's a little bit different in HDR? I hope this helps to show some of you out there exactly how far we've come as filmmakers, what's possible with the technology. And frankly, I'm just thrilled that we were able to work with Mystery Box on that particular piece. So when we got closer to NAB, some would say way too close to NAB, That's not a shot at him. That's a total shot at Panasonic for not giving him enough time. I reached out to Sam KJ. It was about 2.5 weeks before I met AB, and I said, hey, Sam, would you like to work a project? So Sam KJ is our director, and Nich Musco is our cinematographer for a project called PVP. And we wanted to put something together in anamorphic because one of the more avant-garde features of the GH5s is that it will work well with anamorphic lenses, and in fact gives you the entire sensor, the entire 4x3 area of the sensor for anamorphic, which means you get a physically larger sensor than some cameras like, like an F65. It's actually a physically larger sensor for anamorphic than that camera. So I wanted to put something together that shows really what's possible with the GH5s. So Sam, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, I am an indie action producer and director. I've got a big passion for martial arts, action films, and happen to have quite a good network of stunt performers in Los Angeles. So I put together short action content like PVP and like Unmasked, which we did for the GH5. I also have a history in camera technology. I worked at a store called Hot Rod Cameras and helped independent filmmakers put together small camera cinematography packages for 4 years. I've got a lot of experience with every camera from the top level Alexa SXT down to the GH5 to the A7Ss to everything. So I remember the launch of the GH4, I remember the launch of the GH5, and I've been a big fan of what Panasonic's been doing for a long time.
Nich, why don't we go ahead, because just so everybody knows, full disclosure, Sam and I have known each other for years because I've done business with Hot Rod for a very long time, and I couldn't be more proud of the development that he's had. It's like watching your kids grow up. But Nich, you and I have not met really before PVP was done, so I'm going to be learning as much about you right this second as the rest of the audience is going to learn.
My name's Nich Musco. I studied cinematography in Chicago at Columbia College before coming out here. Went to AFI, studied cinematography there, where I actually picked up Steadicam as well, and I teach a 2-day workshop at AFI on camera movement. That's where I met Sam, who was, before he worked at Hot Rod, he was also crewing and doing some grip and electric stuff, and we bonded over pastrami sandwiches, where none of the crew wanted to come out with us, so that's where our relationship kind of started.
How'd you guys end up connecting actually for PVP though, specifically?
We've been friends for a long time and always talked about what movies we like together, especially like action, and like kind of vibed really hard on that. So, when this opportunity came up, I gave Nich a call and I said, hey, you want to race to the finish line with me? And he did, luckily. So that's where it all came together. It started with a pastrami sandwich, went all the way through this production.
And it closed with probably 7,000 Red Bulls on set to keep you guys awake through the rest of the project.
A lot of Red Bull,
yeah,
for sure.
All right. From here, what I want to do is we want to go ahead and play PVP for you all. All right, so I'm going to share with you what I just said to Sam. It's the fan. The fan at the end is what makes the whole piece. So what I want to do now is I want to get into some inspiration. So for Horizons, what inspired you for this specific project?
So like when you first approached us, you were telling us all the new features, and also I hadn't been very familiar with the GH5. And so when you were telling us about the dual ISO, the anamorphic abilities, and then also the ability to actually pipe out of the HDMI 60p, that was kind of like, okay, that's the box that I need to work in. What kind of story, what kind of visuals can I tell with that kind of, to show off those kind of features? And so the biggest thing was the dual native ISO. I hadn't been exposed to it much, but I heard great things about it from the Varicam guys that were shooting a lot of stuff. And so this idea came about of day from night, right? Because you have this ability with this camera in particular to shoot both daylight stuff and night stuff with its native ISO of 800 and 5000. So that's kind of what we went for. We had this theme of going from day to night, and yeah. So we had these two ideas, and we wanted to really experiment with the 3 different main features that were important to me as a filmmaker, which is anamorphic, 4K 60p, and the low light capability. So we really focused on, with our Native American segment, the 4K 60p straight out of the HDMI to an Atomos recorder. With the motorbike, we focused on the anamorphic capabilities, and then with the dancer, we really focused on the dual native ISO, trying to show that when we have a lot of light versus not. So that was that's where it all kind of came from. That was our kind of inspiration, was based off of the technology and what can it do for me as a storyteller. So
I know a question we get a lot online about this piece in particular is how much of it was using the Atomos external recorder versus internal recording?
So the only section would be the Native American section, was that we used we always had it on set and we always were recording to it, but that was the only section that was actually the 60p.
Yeah, and that's because you can only do 10-bit over HDMI out.
Yeah.
I mean, we have 60p internally, but it's 8-bit.
It's 8-bit.
And because the project was HDR,
yep,
we had to deliver in 10-bit.
Yeah, and I mean the internal recording too. That's another big thing that Sam and I both really liked, was the ability to actually record 400 megabits per second, 24p in the camera, which it's an awesome image. So with all the data, and it's 10-bit, which is a big deal for us, especially in the color world and color fidelity sense.
Okay.
So.
All right. Sam, why don't we go ahead and talk a little bit about what inspired you to do PVP?
Well, very much along the same lines. When we were talking about the dual base ISO, and I had experience with it already, having shot with the Vericam lineup, I knew I wanted to shoot in a dark setting. Originally, it was an arcade, and then we moved to a bar because of what we could get as a location on the short notice.
You mean more lead time than we would have had arcade?
Probably,
okay.
Yeah, probably. But
that's my bad.
Not that I'm unhappy with that bar, because that was a really cool location to shoot at. It's called the Attic. It's in Sherman Oaks, by the way, if anybody lives there. But I knew I wanted to do something with an arcade cabinet. I knew I wanted to do something with martial arts. And I knew I wanted to pay some homage to video games, which are a big part of my life and have been a big part of my life for most of my life. So, and I like comedy and I like martial arts, so I thought this was a great chance to kind of mix the two and have a surreal kind of feel to the film. So, and that's where the inspiration came from this.
So obviously your piece is clearly anamorphic,
yeah,
because of the aspect ratio.
Right.
But very different look to the anamorphic that we got from your project versus what we did with Mystery Box. So yours stayed in a traditional 2:3:9 aspect ratio. I'm sure people wonder, which lens did we pair with it?
It was the ingenue anamorphic. I believe it's a 25-72.
Yeah, I think the 32-72.
Yeah, 32-72. Yeah. That's what it is.
Yeah. We might have speed boosted that sucker, if I'm not
Oh,
mistaken.
we certainly did. Yeah, we speed boosted that, which was really nice. We used the Kip-On speed booster, and it turned out really nice. It didn't soften the image too much, and I love to shoot anamorphic. Anamorphic is it's so popular, especially in action films now. So anamorphic felt like the right choice for this project.
Yeah. Now your project was shot anamorphic, but it's not as clear cut because you cropped it.
We
you
cropped
it
it
to
in
16:9, but you have much more telltales in your bokeh and the specular highlights, because there's that close-up of the side profile of the motorcyclist, and you got that beautiful oval-shaped bokeh, which I'm going to imagine you diopted to get that close to it.
Yeah, probably. Yes, I believe so. We did. But yeah, I mean, it's just different technology. I mean, we were shooting with an old set of Russian Lomo lenses, which was front lens, front. What is it? Front element.
Front element ones.
Front element anamorphics versus the rear element with the ingenue. So yeah, they're more. Yeah, you can definitely see them more.
Yeah. I think
the flares and all that stuff.
I think it's cool to show kind of the different ways you can work with anamorphic.
Yeah.
I think people believe that anamorphic has to look very gritty and a rich character optic, but you can also work with optics like the Zeiss Master Primes, Area Master Primes. You can work with the ingenue lenses and get just a very pristine look to your image as well.
Yeah, and that was what I wanted out of this one, because we shot for the GH5, we shot unmasked, and those were classic anamorphics. And I just wanted a very clearly different look from unmasked to PVP, which is why we went with the rear element anamorphic for this one.
Yeah, and just so you all know out there, I'm like a huge anamorphic nerd. We could probably sit here for the next hour and a half talking about them, but we're going to move on. We're actually going to move forward here, and what I want to do is I want to ask Sam. So Sam, obviously you've mentioned a few times, you shot Vericam, you've shot Alexa. You've shot several different cameras, and ultimately the question I have is, how did the GH5 hold up for your production?
I was a big fan of the GH5s. I've shot everything. Actually, the first action film I ever shot was on the Vericam. Second one was on the Vericam LT. Third was on the GH5, and fourth was the 5S. So I kind of started at the Vericam and moved to the smaller cameras. And a big part of why I like these, the 5 and the 5S specifically, is due to their size. The small form factor and the way that we shoot martial arts, the way the camera's moving so often, was really, really attractive to me. Now, what I ended up doing on both the films I shot with these little cameras was build them up with rigs and made them the size of the big cameras, although they're still a little more lightweight. So I really enjoyed shooting on the 5S. There's a lot of accessories that have to be built on it to lend itself to a set production, but I could definitely see myself, if I was running gun, if I had to, do it myself, if I didn't have the ability to put all the extra accessories I generally put on these things, I would feel very comfortable taking that camera and knowing that I'm going to get a really good image out of it. It also would work really great as a B cam to any of the Vericam LT, the Vericam B, C cam, it's a great supplemental camera to the rest of the lineup because of the fact that the color science matches the rest of it. The rest of the lineup, the Vericam LT, the GH5, the GH5S, they all are very easy to match in post. And the color science, I think, is Panasonic's strong suit. It really is intuitive. The skin tones are great right out of the camera. And yeah, I enjoy the whole lineup.
So Nick, you talked a little bit about rigging up the cameras. Obviously, as the cinematographer, you were tasked with a lot of that work, and ultimately tasked with operating the cameras. So thoughts? I know it's a smaller camera, so it tends to be a little different than working with a cine camera.
Yeah, and I will say, to its credit, having rigged it out, you kind of don't need to at the same time, and that was obviously a very, we had a full crew, we had a ton of lights. The whole point was to build it up into more of a cinema full setup sort of mode, but if you strip all that away, the sensor's the same, the image we captured is pretty much the same, minus the lens. But ultimately, all those additional things you don't totally need, it did make our lives a little bit easier.
Wait, so you're saying I could have paid less and you wouldn't have had to rent it all that?
I didn't say that. I did not say that.
I think the point is that we can fill a very similar look if we have a budget that's not necessarily going to meet what we would need for dollies and things like that, right?
Yeah, and obviously we wanted to go a little bit bigger. We put a lot of light into the camera. But ultimately, kind of whipping it around, it was kind of nice. I tend to not like shooting with smaller cameras, but with the Ingenue anamorphic zoom on the front of it, it did help add some heft to it. The build of the rig added some weight to it, and a lot of the stuff in front of the cabinet, the arcade cabinet, was just on a slider, so I was whipping around pretty quickly. It felt right. It didn't feel too small, too big, too anything. It was just right.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right. So I know you guys aren't expecting this, but I'm going to ask you the same exact question.
Okay.
So what did you think of the GH5s? I know you shoot red typically and you do a lot of 8K production now.
Yeah. We actually really enjoyed it. I was actually super impressed with it. I mean, the biggest thing is what they were saying too, is I was really impressed with the V-Log. Panasonic's log format is probably one of the better ones out there in my personal opinion. And so, again, the skin tone reproduction, all that stuff was great, and that was a big thing for me as a cinematographer, especially since I've been doing and working with 4K for a long time, and I've kind of been there with this whole process. It was good to see a log format that actually did what I wanted it to when I did. And then it was impressive to me because I had been so anti-digital SLRs for such a long time. When the 5D came out and all that stuff, I was just kind of blew it off because there was the jello effect and this and that. There's a lot of stuff with the digital SLRs that kind of annoyed me, that made me kind of hate them. So I kind of, I haven't shot much on them. But using this smaller form factor, even now, we have a few of our clients now that are asking us to shoot on the Panasonic GH5s just because they like the skin, especially when I have a cosmetic client That's all they want us to shoot on for their behind-the-scenes stuff and for their live productions, is just because the skin tone reproduction is so great and the form factor is so small, and that they can move it around and do stuff. And so I'm finally actually getting a little jelly of the smaller form factor of the digital SLRs. Having said that too, like Sam and Nick, when we did our production, we did build it out, mainly because we needed to support the hefty lens. And so once you do that, obviously you need to build a cage and put some rails. But yeah, like they said too, it's the same sensor. So even if you're shooting on, you know, obviously glass is important, but as long as you're shooting on good glass, the sensor's strong, and yeah, you're gonna get great images out of it. So
Samuel, Jacob mentioned Vlog and his interest in it and how much he likes it, but ultimately you're the guy who has to work with it. So what did you think of working with Vlog L? Yeah,
Vlog L was really great. I really loved working on it in color correction. It just held together so well. There's so much latitude that it's recording. It's just keeping all of the details. It's got a 422 10-bit color science inside, and as it's storing its format, which means that I basically had as much latitude in that as if I was shooting with ProRes, as if I was, you know, shooting in any of these other formats. If I was shooting in a red log format or a Sony log format or an Arri log format, like having that Vlog L inside the GH5s, it just holds together so well in post, and I can push it as far as I need to go without the image falling apart on me, which is really important. We were working on some documentary footage, and we did have to push it, and it largely held together, which was phenomenal to me. It just blew me away seeing how far we could push.
And just to add to that, the other thing I really liked was just that the 14 stops at dynamic range with the camera, which was really, really impressive. So, yeah.
Terrific.
I do want to add one thing.
I heard you breathe over my head.
Well, yeah, sorry. I was,
You blew in his ear.
You brought up the rolling shutter, and that's something I forgot to talk about. In action martial arts specifically, the way we whip the camera around, I'm just like blown away at how little rolling shutter this camera has. And anybody who's doing handheld, anybody who's doing anything that involves a lot of motion, you can automatically see the difference between this camera and other cameras in its size and sensitivity that I won't name right now, and the rolling shutter differences. The rolling shutter on this is amazing, and
we had some whip pans too.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you saw we had a bunch of whip pans, and I mean, you can kind of see it, but it's more of like I liked it the way it kind of just a little bit, just enough, and but we have so much where we follow like a hand down here. When Alvin goes down to grab his leg, we follow him down, and there's like I didn't notice any rolling shutter on that, and that is a huge merit to this camera.
And I would add to that too. I was talking to a cinematographer yesterday, and he was complaining about, because I was telling him our experience with the GH5s, and he was talking about the new Sony cameras that are coming out, but he was complaining about the Micro Four Thirds sensor, and I think that's a big testament. The rolling shutter issue is a big testament to the Micro Four Thirds sensor, since it's smaller. It's going to scan quicker, and that's why it's, And he was complaining about the depth of field, but that, as you get more into, shooting and learning stuff, it's not that big, having a bigger sensor is not going to make your stuff better, so.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to beat rolling shutter to death apparently here, but one last point I just want to make sure everybody understands. When you use an anamorphic lens, you're squeezing, in this case, the image twice as narrow, and you're stretching it twice as tall, which means when we de-squeeze it, we're now double the width, and it really accentuates rolling shutter a lot. Rolling shutter becomes much more apparent with an anamorphic production, so that's where some of the whip pans that you'll see where you may see rolling shutter on your piece, which is really just the opening one where you guys really whipped it, that ultimately is really more influenced by the anamorphic lens than it was in the sensor itself.
And again, I mean, I liked it. I liked the way it looked, so.
All right, so the next, we spent a lot of time on rolling shutter, but the real question people have out there, like number one topic we get asked is, how's the low light? Is it really as good as we say it is, or is it just a bunch of hype? I mean,
I think it's really as good as you guys hype it as. I mean, it's one of those things that it's like almost relearning as a cinematographer. You're kind of like, I'm used to lighting stuff, and I'm used to now with like LED lights that are so small and so powerful, and all the stuff. I can light scenes that I really want. But one thing, and I talked about this in NAB, was the low light capability allows me, like the 5000 ISO, gave me was the ability to capture what I saw. So there's one example is when you go to a set and you're a scene, or you go like, this looks beautiful, then you turn your camera on, unlike a photographer who can all of a sudden use, just his shutter settings and stuff like that to get the actual exposure right, to capture that beautiful scene in low light. With film and with video and stuff, we're not able to typically do that because we're limited by our shutter speed, our frame rate, and all that other stuff. But with 5000 ISO, I was finally able to turn it on and see a scene that my eyes saw just as well as it would have been if I had to augment it with lights. And so it's changing the way I think too.
So in post, did it hold up pretty well?
Yeah, it's incredible. We did some tests right when we got the camera because we wanted to see just how far we could push it and see what we were trading off when we switched to the deeper ISO to shoot into the darks. And we realized we weren't trading off anything. Normally you'd have to be sacrificing dynamic range or increasing noise, but when we switched to that higher ISO, it was just as clean and we had as much dynamic range as at the lower ISO. And I sat there like agape, just going like, this doesn't feel right, because it's against what we've been taught and what we've been doing our whole lives. You go to a faster speed, you increase the noise, you increase this. It blew me away at how much we could retain at such little light levels.
And how identical the two ISOs were,
Yeah.
Okay. Well, a big part of what we wanted to deliver was an HDR project, and that was kind of a new thing for you two.
Yes.
So before we get into the challenges of working in HDR, why don't we first talk about the reward. So how do you think HDR is going to be impacted for consumers? I mean, the people who ultimately watch your work, what are they going to get from it? What kind of impact do you think it'll have on filmmaking?
Before this project, I didn't really pay much attention to HDR. After this project, I'm thoroughly convinced HDR is the next jump we're gonna make. It's like HD was for HD TV. When we moved to HD TV, it's that important. And
More so than 4K, do you think?
More so than 4K, more so than more so than anything else, and more so than resolution. Because at home TVs, 4K resolution. If you're sitting on your couch, you can't see that. If you're sitting on your couch at home, HDR is huge. Mostly in the highlights and the lowlights, but the specular highlights in HDR, I just remember when I first saw it on the screen in the colorist's room, and it just blew me away. The way that the highlights pop, the way the amount of colors you get out of that red 2020 color space is just, it's really mind-blowing. And after coloring it in HDR, and when we finally put the looks down to SDR, it was such a bummer to see it go down to SDR again. And I honestly think, and of course, TVs are going to be looking for the next thing. HDR is going to be the next thing in TVs. It's going to sell more TVs. We're always moving forward. And HDR is extremely important. It's something everyone should be paying attention to. It's something everybody should be learning because of the way that those highlights pop, and because of that little bit of extra detail you get in those shadows, and how much more it adds to your image and how much more weight it gives to your shot. It blew me away, and I'm really, really excited about it and going forward.
Yeah, and that's why when our film was playing, why I hopped down there to actually watch both side by side, because I've only actually gotten to see our film in HDR twice, 3 times, while we were coloring at NAB and now here. And our project in particular was very colorful, very bright. I tend to white should be very bright white to me, not all the time, but in this project in particular, I wanted everything to pop. And just seeing it again in HDR on that monitor, I was like, oh, that feels so nice. Oh, the colors are so vibrant. This is exactly what I was going for. And I agree, the same exact thing, that let's stop talking about 4K and 6K, 8K. It's not as important as potentially being able to see this type of stuff at home, if that's your intent, if that's what your project should look like, which ours was. Not every project should look like that, obviously, but having the ability to push to that level was really important, and it's kind of mind-blowing to see it going, where has this been? It's here.
So Samuel, I actually want to address something with you really quick.
Okay.
I should have let you guys cover some of this, but the truth is you've been doing it for years, and now it's boring to you. But they've made HDR for a very long time. I just want people to understand why the GH5s is a good delivery tool for HDR. Can you give us some technical background on, if I'm using an HEVC codec, I want to play it on the side of the television, or if I'm going to master a UHD in HEVC, what are the minimum specs required for us to deliver HDR?
So for HDR, like one of the big jumps is that everything has to be 10-bit. If it's not 10-bit, you can't do HDR. And having 10-bit native internal to the GH5s, being able to capture in 10-bit, keeping enough detail levels in each stop that it's not going to break apart. Since we're using a much higher dynamic range at the screen, which gives us a much bigger box to play in as filmmakers, we have to retain more detail levels throughout more stops. We can't just roll things and crush them together and give 10 levels of detail to 5 stops. It's going to fall apart if we try and pull those gradients in HDR. So you need that 10-bit and you need that 422 color space. And the GH5 holds up because it's doing that and it's doing it at a high bit rate. It's not super compressed. Like it is compressed, but it's not so compressed that you're creating block artifacting and these steppings that you would normally see out of a DSLR, out of a form factor that small. And so we can either shoot in the native hybrid log gamma that the GH5s shoots in and basically translate it directly to screen, or we can shoot in VLOG-L, we can do a PQ master, we can bring it up, we can bring it down. We have this giant box of delivery that we can send to our consumers. And just to piggyback on what Sam said, to me, it's a big of a technology jump as from analog to digital, right? It's such a new thing. And more importantly, consumers already have HDR. Almost every TV on the market has some kind of HDR capability at this point.
If it's a 4K TV,
If it's a 4K TV, it has HDR, maybe to a limited degree, but it's there. So consumers are waiting for HDR content, and the GH5s means that we can be shooting it today on any size budget.
Yep.
So let's talk about that with delivery then. And I'm going to bring this to Jacob because I know delivery is all you think about. So when we're talking about delivery, as much as we'd all like to be mastering and then putting it on a UHD Blu-ray disc or for broadcast, the realities are the infrastructure is not even really there yet for broadcast. We can obviously deliver content through UHD, but a lot of our operators are just not quite there yet in terms of their level of production. What are some other ways to deliver other than Netflix and Amazon?
Well, so I mean, the biggest thing too is, and that's kind of where we got our start as in YouTube, and so we actually helped YouTube introduce HDR to, the platform in general. And so, YouTube's actually the best way to actually view it, and you can stream it straight to your TV, your computer screens, now that more and more computer screens are actually introducing HDR as well.
And your phones, a lot of phones.
And your phones, a lot of phones that do HDR as well. And so YouTube and Vimeo are actually great platforms and are available right now for us to actually share with people HDR content. So, yeah.
Were you guys happy with the delivery when you saw it on YouTube?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It's just, again, it's always hard to go back to SDR after seeing it in HDR.
I just want all of you to understand.
Sorry, that's an alarm I forgot to turn off.
Ultimately, what we want to do is we want to make sure that filmmakers know that HDR is something you can deliver in right now. And the reason that I want our content created in HDR is that it gives me a master on YouTube. So when I hear complaints from people, well, I see this blocking in this shot, or I see this noise over here, I'm able to ask the client, are you watching it in HDR? Because I'm not seeing it in the master file, and I'm not seeing it on the YouTube file that I uploaded. Are you sure it's not something that YouTube is introducing? And we can all confirm that there is a huge difference in the data rate that YouTube delivers content when you go to HDR. They go to what's called VP9.2 for its deliverable, and it's a much higher data rate. It's nearly Blu-ray in terms of its data rate. So you're getting Blu-ray UHD deliverables effectively from the YouTube stream, which I think is an incredibly powerful tool for a filmmaker who might get some questions from people.
Right.
And ultimately, it's being let down by the compression codec more than it is the content that you're creating.
And YouTube's actually been super helpful too, especially the filmmaker community, of allowing us to actually do our own, like LUTs, and Sam could talk about this more, to do the SDR conversion as well. And so when you upload something in HDR, obviously you're gonna get the better quality upload and streaming, but also you're going to be able to customize your downstream as well to SDR.
Yeah, and so you can fine tune how you want it to look on the SDR monitors. Vimeo, you have to upload 2 separate files. With YouTube, I can upload 1 file and YouTube slices it up and puts that LUT, our look, onto our SDR content. And so we can give the best delivery in all formats across all platforms.
Oh, terrific. So we've actually reached nearly the end of our questions, and I want to make sure that the folks who are here in the audience get to ask some questions of us on the stage. So unless there's anything else you guys absolutely had to get to right this second.
No.
Are there any questions out in the audience? There's a gentleman right here raising his hand.
How are you guys exposing for the vlog?
So the question was, how are we exposing for vlog? Do you guys want to cover that?
Yeah, I'll cover that. We actually, for HDR, we have a whole blog post that we wrote and a workflow that we wrote up for exposing in HDR for the Vlog L on the GH5s. You can go to mysterybox.us to find that. We're trying to centralize all of our HDR content, so we have a new platform that you'll be able to go to in a little bit. But really what we're doing is we're treating Vlog as a container. And so we're saying, okay, how many stops do we want to retain above our neutral skin tone? And then exposing our Vlog accordingly. So we use the guidelines that Panasonic has put out for how many stops above and below 18%. And then basically treat that as the box that we're shooting in. Then we'll use our scopes to make sure that we're landing within that box. We'll use false color. We'll use all of the tools that are available to us to figure that out. But yeah, that's how we look at the Vlog L, especially for an HDR finish. Knowing how many stops above and below skin tones we're retaining is extremely important.
And then just to give it technical, based on what our engineers want, if you expose an 18 gray to 42 IRE on an IRE scale, that would be your 18 gray point. And then 62 IRE should be about 90 white. So if you're using a 90 white card, you should expect it to land about 62 IRE. And then that's where you get, based on our measurements, not necessarily what Mystery Box measured. We're about 5 stops under, 5 stops above, 6 stops under 18 gray, give or take, just depending on how sensitive you are to noise.
I want to also add that we had, for our project, I think I had about 4 hours to test the camera the night before we shot. We didn't have a monitor that had HDR. We weren't looking at Rec 2020 while we were shooting, so I definitely treated the camera more like the current, like the status quo of all other digital cameras. I knew going into it we were going to be in this super dark area. I knew we used only quasar rainbow lights, the RGB lights. So I had a little bit of testing with that, but for the most part, we shot at 800. I rated it like 200 to 400, so overexposing like anywhere from 1 to 2 stops on everything, knowing I was going to pull everything back down. But as far as like going into HDR, like lighting that dark space and giving it as much latitude as I could with not totally knowing what was going to happen in post, those results for us were fantastic. And we got a lot of stretch out of that negative afterwards once we got to the colorist, and the whole thing really came to life. So even just like monitoring in SDR, going back and forth from the Vlog to 709 and kind of having that as a base with the knowledge that there's going to be more room to pull out. Obviously, I wish we had more knowledge and more capabilities, which now I know are there and exist. So moving forward, the technology's there to find all this out and fill out your HDR properly.
Okay, I think we have another question from the crowd.
I just want to say I concur with what Sam had said earlier, that this technology is exactly the paradigm shift that we went through when we switched from standard definition to HD. And I remember the days where we would monitor on set in SD, whether it be a CRT monitor or a waveform monitor, but we were shooting in HD. And you bring up an interesting point that we're at the point in this shift that although we're shooting HDR, we still have major issues for how do we monitor it on set from the shooting and acquisition side of it, but then also in post-production. And I know there's various tools out there, like Atomos has their little monitors where you can do the little slider and get it to show you representation of the HDR. But then also in post, are you using SDR scopes? And the reason I bring that up, I was watching an interesting demo by Panasonic on shading HDR and SDR simultaneously. And during that webcast, they actually said, we don't even have an HDR waveform monitor. It's not available yet. So I just wanted to see as far as what your comments are as far as how do we overcome that right now? Is the solution to do what we did in the transition to HD, where we're going to use SDR monitoring devices, knowing that we're maximizing the master for HDR, or at what point are we going to switch over that we're going to watch everything and shoot everything in an HDR?
So why don't I start with a rudimentary explanation of how I do it, because I don't have any of your tools nor care to use them. So in my case, when I'm shooting a project, I rely almost exclusively on my scopes and make sure that I'm exposing my midtones where I want my midtones to be, and then just making sure I don't overblow a highlight. And that gives me a good, I love your digital negative, to be able to stretch that file in post and get a reasonably accurate representation of what I was hoping for. So at the very baseline, if you just shoot with scopes, you can get a really reasonable representation. And GH5s has scopes inbuilt. There are people who offer false color LUTs that you can load in as well, and then you can just pull up a LUT on the GH5s and use that as your reference as well. As we go up through to what Sam was doing in post, you guys actually used a production monitor, not a grading monitor, but you used a playback monitor, correct?
Yeah, Shogun Inferno. Is what, yeah, we used the Shogun Inferno for our reference monitor, but mostly stuck to scopes. Yeah. The internal scopes in Final Cut Pro and After Effects that's where I really paid attention to my exposure.
And you guys use a really cheap monitor, if I'm not mistaken. You can say the name.
Yeah, I think of Small H. No,
we use both the Small HD 1703 and the.
That's not the cheap one I'm talking about. The one you use in post.
Oh yeah, we have a BVMX. Yeah. But I would say, to bring up your point about exposing and stuff and using SDR, from my personal experience, and I've been doing HDR for a long time, there's not much difference. The only thing you have to make sure you do now is to not clip your highlights. And that's the biggest thing, because now, you know, with HDR, if your sky is blown out, your audience is just going to see a big blown out white sky that at 1,000 or 10,000 nits, and it's going to blind them. So you want to make sure that it's not just all white, it has detail in it. And that's personally all I do. And then we work with it in post, but as long as you're not exposing your highlights and you're doing you're doing the same kind of monitoring techniques that you use as SDR, it's not a big deal. That's just me saying that.
Yeah, I think fortunately, like the SDR HDR transition, there was a big change in like critical focus and where that was at. And it was, you know, you had a lot more leeway in SDR than HDR. In SD than HD. Yeah. Luckily, HDR doesn't quite have that dangerous territory as much as it's just make sure stuff's not blown out, make sure you're in your exposure range, and then in post you're able to pull out that HDR image.
So I think we'll take this as our very last question here, and then we'll wrap up.
I'm a little late to getting into HDR because I just honestly felt intimidated by it.
Just so you know, you're not late. You're early. Just so you know.
Yeah.
Good. That's reassuring. So you know, I edit on a 5K iMac, and so my question is, if I'm shooting in HDR, do I need a monitor? And if I do, what's the point? Yeah.
All right. So I want to turn this over to you, Samuel, because you guys wrote a nice little article on it.
Yeah.
Three different monitors, but one of them might not be in the budget of some of the folks who are here.
Yeah. So one of the things about HDR is that the monitor has to be able to display the dynamic range as best as is possible. And the 5K iMac and any desktop monitor that doesn't have HDR capabilities isn't going to reproduce them as well as if you have an external grading monitor. So obviously the Sony BVMX is the top of the line if you have $45,000, but if you don't, the Small HD 1703 or the Atomos Sumo
the P3X,
or P3X,
yes.
Or the Atomos Sumo 19, you can get the M version without the recorder. They have, I think I measured one at like 10.5, and the other was 11.5 stops of dynamic range, and their peaks are right around 1,000 nits. We wrote up a workflow on how to use those to grade because you really, really do need a grading monitor that's interpreting the HDR signal. The HDR signal is different than the SDR signal and how the monitors change digital values into light values. And so you really want to pipe that out of a program like DaVinci Resolve that isn't going to be trying to tweak it. If you're using Mac OS, you're using Windows, those operating systems are going to try and change and tweak the colors so you lose control over that. So you want that second external reference monitor, that grading monitor that you can configure and set up for HDR and then maybe change its brightnesses to see different parts of your HDR image if you're not using a 17-stop monitor like ours. But even at 11 and a half stops, you're doing really, really wonderful things. You're seeing more stuff than you could in SDR on those monitors.
There's something very important here, though, and that is you have to have an intermediary box between your display and your computer.
Yeah, you need to have...
This is incredibly important, so if there's nothing you get out of this meeting, write this one thing down. Go ahead.
You need to have an output box. You need to have a card. You need to be using either an Aja or Blackmagic or whatever ecosystem you're in to be sending that signal out. Otherwise, your operating system is going to try and tweak and touch that color. You have to keep that separate. So you really should be using a color program like DaVinci Resolve that you can download for free and then use a $145 external box to send out either an HDMI or an SDI signal to these monitors and get a clean image.
The key also is for flagging purposes.
Yeah.
So if your monitor doesn't have the ability to manually turn on the...
Yeah, if you're using a television, you're going to need to pipe out an HDMI and then inject HDR metadata into that to make sure that that works. And again, I have all of this written up on the Mystery Box blog on how to do that. Come talk to me afterwards and I can get you set up.
Well, folks, I know that we have folks freaking out right now because it's time for us to turn the theater over. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I appreciate your attendance and thank you so much.